So welcome, Professor Sennett and Nick, and welcome to today's talk. Okay, I should speak louder. Yeah, can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So let's start now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of this year's CT seminar. And I'm Yufei, and I'm delighted to host this exciting series with my three colleagues, Peli, Rashid, and Karam. The CT seminar is co-hosted by PhD students from the Department of Architecture and Geography at Cambridge University. It has a prominent history of exploring topics in the field of urban studies, with a commitment to taking an interdisciplinary perspective by bringing together academics, practitioners, and students. Amid the many challenges and uncertainties we are facing in the current time, we are very happy to welcome you all here online and appreciate everyone's patience and support to make the seminar possible. So now I will hand over to Peli and Rashid to introduce our themes this year and our guest speakers.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Haley. So let me just do a quick share of this. So you can find this, of course, on the Martin Center and Crash website. And you can also subscribe to our Twitter, our Eventbrite page, our Facebook, so you can get updates. So we will be putting more of the links for the speakers that you can see on the left. It's a great lineup of speakers, and we're very, very excited to bring this to you this term. Our topic is urban guilt, and it is split into three subtopics: places as cultural clusters, places of vernacular creativity, and hyperguilt in alternative spaces. So of course, take your time to look through all these, and we will also be covering them throughout the seminar series, and I hope you enjoy each and every one that we have prepared with our very eminent speakers. Rashid, over to you.
Thank you. All right, to set the context of this talk, I would like to read one of my from the Craftsman. It begins as a story about workshops, the guilds of the medieval goldsmith, the atelier of musical instrument makers like Antonio Stradivari, modern laboratories in which masters and apprentices work together, but as unequals. The craftsman's struggle with machines is portrayed in the 18th century invention of robots. In the pages of that Bible of the Enlightenment, Diderot's encyclopedia, and in the 19th century's growing fear of the industrial machines. The craftsman's consciousness of material appears in the long history of making bricks, a history that stretches from ancient Mesopotamia to our own time. A history that shows the way anonymous workers can leave traces of themselves in inanimate things. So I shall briefly introduce our speakers, beginning with Richard Sennett, who over the course of the last 5 decades has written about social lives in cities, changes in labor, and social theories. His books include The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, The Cultures of the New Capitalism, The Craftsman, Buildings and Dwellings, and Designing Disorder. Dr. Nicholas is a lecturer and director of the MPhil in Architecture and Urban Studies at the Department of Architecture. He is an ethnographer and architect with an interest in improvised city planning, specialized in cities of the Middle East and North Africa. He is currently teaching a course exploring exurbs and enclaves, where the research of this talk series was heavily influenced and adapted from. And without further ado, Yalla, Nick. You're on mute.
Hello. Thank you so much to the whole Martin Center team and the organizers for putting this wonderful series together really quickly in very unusual circumstances. I know that everyone is kind of overcommitted by being permanently available given this new wonderful miraculous technology that is at once handy but also kind of erodes the walls between work and life. So thank you for managing to attract such wonderful people and for putting all this together firstly. So I'd like to welcome our esteemed speaker, Professor Richard Sennett. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Delighted.
Your writing has heavily inspired, I think, the theme of this talk series on the Guild and what it has meant, what it could mean, what it means today, what it could mean in the future, or derivations thereof. And I know your work has also inspired me greatly, in particular a class that I offer second years in the department on the neighborhood, where we explore the history of the idea of the neighborhood in philosophy and in planning. So I think it's wonderfully appropriate that you are the first speaker. I think we're very, very fortunate to have you kind of open up the theme and expand maybe its meanings for our, I think, very kind of broad audience, particularly because, you know, it's often thought of as a historicized concept, as one that might not be relevant for today, especially if I'm thinking of our younger audience who might associate it purely with the notion of the medieval. So I guess, you know, we're gonna have a kind of open format conversation, I think, unless you have something prepared that you'd like to speak, which we can of course also fit.
Well, I tell you what, why don't
forward.
I?
But,
I
but
do
otherwise, I wanted to get the
Hello.
Sorry.
I could maybe start us off with a few remarks. Then we could. I don't know how we have a conversation with 120 people, but I'll leave that problem to you. Okay. Can you hear me easily?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it would be great. I mean, I was just gonna bounce around a few ideas for a chat, but I think it'd be wonderful if you welcome us all with what you have prepared, if possible.
Well, this,
maybe I'll ask questions on
this
that.
is just okay. Well, this is really just some comments to which I hope are provoking. I'm very uneasy about your theme, urban guilds, and I think the impulse is great, but I think you need to have a rethink, maybe about what you mean by this. And the first thing is that guilds historically were very, in cities, were very ambivalent experiences for people. In the Middle Ages, they were strong, but starting about in the 15th century, they became weakened in a very curious way. That, you know, that people in cities wore the costumes of guilds. They wore the pins, the hats, even the clothing, work clothing of particular guilds to identify themselves as a butcher, for instance, or a candle maker. And that gave them a kind of recognition on the streets of the city. But around, during the time of the Renaissance, something begins to break down, which is that newcomers in the city begin to adopt this clothing without actually being members of the guilds. And what you get is a kind of false picture of order in the city, because people who are coming in as strangers to the city in order to insert themselves in the city, to create an identity for themselves, to be recognized and included, are essentially making up who they are. And so the guilds were sort of eviscerated by immigration. The guilds lost their particularity as identities to the influx of strangers in the city. And in technical terms, the body of people who are dressed as guild members, well, it became an arbitrary sign. And this was a form of freedom for people. And I just say this to you because I think there's a resonance in this, that pinning people down to who they really are is a form of exclusion. Whereas this kind of arbitrary sign language of belonging allows inclusion. So it's just a signal of a problem that reappears much later. And this is the second thing I want to talk to you about the relation between guilds and syndicates, or guilds and unions. Most unions, most syndicates started as craft unions. That is, like the old guilds. They were limited to people who did one kind of work. And in time, that became very exclusionary. The guild became a way of excluding people by race, gender, who didn't fit the image of what that kind of worker was like. It's a big story both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in that pretty much what happened was that guilds were ways that these craft unions, which were the closest thing we know today to guilds, were ways of excluding those other workers. And gradually that breaks down. It broke down in the US in what were called industrial unions, in which had lots of different kinds of workers who belonged to them. And it broke down in the United Kingdom in unions or syndicates like Unite, which take people in from all walks of manual labor. The thing about this is that this breakdown of the guild structure was a good thing, in that what it allowed a politics on the left of fighting for fundamental rights of all workers, not just workers who did a particular kind of work. So it became, rather than inclusion, it became a force for reform and for asserting the right of any worker who worked to have basic good conditions of pay. In the US, for instance, the union to which I belong is called the United Auto Workers Union. And I and 18,000 other university lecturers belong to the United Auto Workers Union, because it's fought for, not for me personally, because I'm too old, but it's fought for the rights of young university lecturers to enjoy the same kind of conditions of hourly restraint of hours and protections in healthcare that a skilled auto worker, a mechanic, or a welder would enjoy. So that's why I think you should maybe reframe what you're doing. You want to find a form of organization in which is inclusive rather than exclusive. And guilds, whether in their old form or as craft unions, were exclusive bodies, dividing up labor and not honoring people who did have a specific skill as part of the collectivity. The last thing I wanted to say to you just briefly is how this fits into the framework of us as as designers and urbanists. One thing we have understood to our cost is that the skills of design are not very recognized by capitalist structures, that a good design is very, very rarely rewarded in the marketplace. And that's when I was teaching at Cambridge, that this was an issue we talked, I don't know if it's still on your minds, but the idea that we had was that somehow the political problem for the design professions was how to actually make the economic system value the skills we had. And my impression is that that problem continues. You just have to look around London at the new designs for office towers, which are largely crap, you know? The skills of design are just not something that is economically recognized. So in that sense, our expertise is something that we'd like to be honored. My thought about this, however, is that the way to honor it is, rather than by looking at guild structures, looking at ways in which we can combine with the public, with office workers, people, cleaners in buildings, people who are associated with either making or using the built environment, rather than people who are the powerful ones creating it. And that we should have, just as like the Unite Union or the United Auto Workers, that we should become part of this broader tent in which the cooperative structures we have are with the people who actually make the structures work or have to live in them. And that we need a kind of environmental union that brings designers into relation with the public rather than in relation to power. And that this kind of environmental union would be a way to resist the abuse of or the neglect of the distinct powers we have. So anyhow, that's what I wanted to say to you. I think this is really the wrong model that you're using. It's just not right. And it's indicative of a notion that rather than privileging ourselves, we have to have a different relation to the public.
Okay, maybe I'll pick up on that. I mean, I think this is a very provocative response to the theme, which though I think is intended to be provocative, right? Because we live in a moment of division, and the tension between inclusion and exclusion is always present, and the territories of inclusion and exclusion are ever shifting, and sometimes we see it at the scale of the city, sometimes at the scale of the nation state. I mean, just to kind of push back a little bit and see, you know, what your thoughts on a different story of the legacy of the Guild might flow through, let's say, the cooperative tradition, moving through people like Robert Owen and places like New Harmony or New Lanark, the idea of solidarity organizations and cooperatives. It might move through notions of mutual aid in the anarchist tradition of Piotr Kropotkin, who has a particular reading of the medieval guild as a kind of more horizontal institution. How do you feel about those kind of narratives?
Well, I don't think that really gets you out of the problem, because when you talk about solidarity, solidarity means that people can identify themselves with other people. This touches on a big theme in my theoretical work. I believe in cooperation, not solidarity. Cooperation is something that people who are different can practice together. Whereas solidarity is something that assumes that you have something in common which you're going to organize around. Owen, for instance, struggled with this enormously in New Harmony. That is, who should be admitted into the community. If people were too different, he worried that the community of New Harmony would fall apart. Well, that's a very anti-urban worry, right? About how to keep people who might dissolve the solidarity out. So that's one of the, but this, as I say, it's a more general issue to me that we should be focusing on cooperation rather than on solidarity. And that means that we're looking at the kind of interspace, the intersectionality between identities rather than on clear-cut identities in communities.
So, this is an interesting, like as a provocation to that, it was looking at Max Weber's definition of the neighborhood as a space for support in times of urgency, rather than the household, which is kind of the day-to-day support. And when we think of the territories of kind of associational life in a city, there are boundaries that can be enormously productive and enormously dangerous and frightening. So a term that comes up a lot, at least in the beginning of the Craftsman, and I wanted to kind of bring it up in relation to what you're saying in terms of associational life and solidarity that goes beyond the identity and identitarian politics, is the notion of embeddedness, right? Which comes out of the work of Karl Polanyi, writing about how the enclosures movement split up everyday life and uprooted people from their relations to each other. Now, there's a very nostalgic reading of the past that a certain right-wing tradition mobilizes. But if we think about how longevity, how the trade-off between the long-term and the short-term is so common in the city, if we think about how people can build associations over time, what is the scale of that, do you think? And how do we talk about the kind of solidarity you're talking about at the local level, right? So, or is this still something that we should keep within the framework of the nation state?
Well, those are rather different questions. First, I'm not talking about solidarity. I'm talking about cooperation. And the reason for that is that cooperation can be something that you do short term rather than try and guarantee the long term. That's in the book that Paulo Sendra and I just wrote about these infrastructures of disorder. What we're interested in is the way that people can come together as in an emergency like the one we're living through now, a health emergency, without the notion that that they have to be together long term. And that's the urban condition. It's in flux, it's dynamic, it's fluid. I'll give an example of this practically. You know that I work for the UN. That's why I left Cambridge, the wonderful halls of Cambridge for the sub-basement of the UN headquarters. One of the things we're doing there is that we're trying to enable people without much access to medical resources to use some rather simple web tools to keep in touch with each other. We have a project in Delhi, for instance, where we've given people out a lot of quite simple software that they can use on their phones to know who else in places where they live might need help if somebody's isolating, how to bring them medicine, food, something like that. And the essence about that is the way we've done it is that it only gives people either an address, or if they live in even poorer communities where there is no address, a kind of avatar name, so that we aren't caught up in the deep, long-rooted tensions between Muslims and Hindus in Delhi. People don't know who they're helping. And that, oddly, thanks to this web technology, has meant that people can cooperate much better. They don't need to know who they're helping. They just know that there is somebody who needs help. They need food, they need aspirin, whatever. So that's, I mean, it's just a different way of thinking about cooperation. And it's detached from things like community, feeling good about, other people, hanging out on the street corner and all of that with your mates. That's all something that's nice, but it doesn't seem to me that it's as urgent or as deep as the need to find ways in which people can cooperate across difference. And that means eschewing solidarity for a much more urban notion of association with other people, And it's, as I said, this tech that this program that we designed enables that, so that that we can actually help people provide aid to other very poor people who they don't know. So that, anyhow, I'm sorry to be so resistant to this, but I think it's so mistaken to focus on guilds. It embodies everything that seems to me to be the problem with social life in cities.
Well, okay, but I mean, so when we talk about digital technology, though, anonymity can be an instrument for wonderful examples of cooperation that go beyond identity and identification, or indeed affection and kind of sentimental belonging, but it can also be enormously divisive at the same time.
Sure.
So the same kind of patterns of exclusion can manifest, and also people might tend to find their kind of effective in-group digitally, anonymously, as well as supporting each other. So I don't know, how do you think about that?
Sure, that could happen. I mean, it depends how you design, what you design and what the purpose of it is. Of course, the technology is neutral. It's what you want to do with it.
So I mean, so to bring it back maybe to the craftsman and how we think of not only the means and the scale of support, of cooperation, but also the kind of mechanisms and quality. You mentioned the kind of one of the very early quotes in the first paragraph you say is, the carpenter, the lab technician, the conductor are all craftsmen because they're dedicated to good work for its own sake.
Craft spirit, yeah.
A kind of the craft spirit, and a kind of let's say a kind of tradition that's described in Kropotkin, pulling from the classics, Aristotle and Plato, is the idea that a sense of justice comes through pride in one's work and work as quality work as an end, not a means to a kind of production and consumption.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, how do we, if that is the craftsman an aspiration today to think about cities, or is it not? And if it is, then given the definition about, good work for its own sake, how do we think of that today, right? How do we think of the quality of cooperation rather than the means?
Well, rather, you lost me.
So how do we think about the quality of cooperation rather than merely the means? So when we speak of the digital or the neighborhood. You know, it seems to me that both of these things can be exclusive or inclusive. Technology is neutral, but can be manipulated for various purposes.
Sure.
The bigger point in the craftsman to me is the mode and the value of a end that is a quality invested in something.
Well, which is very.
How does one think of the city?
I'm losing you. You're breaking up.
I'm sorry. How do we think of the city in that way? I mean, is that still a salient value to think about?
Absolutely.
Buildings and city living.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very hard for, despite all the flannel about good design, you know, basically most certainly in countries like the United Kingdom or the US, the fact that the environment looks so dull is so uniform is a sign that the craft of urban design is just not something people put much value on. To me, what's very striking about this, again, is something that I've felt since I went to the UN, is that there's a real contradiction in these advanced capitalist societies between the amount of talent, particularly in Britain, the amount of design talent and its use. You know, it's almost as though it does, and it's true in the US too. I mean, but particularly in Britain, which is so design rich, and most of these designers who are young are not going to get work. You know, they're certainly not going to get work building a skyscraper. Whereas in a place like, well, I'm not thinking so much of India, but Thailand, Indonesia, there is a scarcity of talent. People have left, you know, they need the kind of skills which are here. And there's a will to make things well, but the people who could make them are leaving the societies, and brain drain in design throughout Southeast Asia. So it's a real paradox, it seems to me, about the sort of indifference to the craft of building among the powers that be here, and a kind of desire for it in less endowed countries. This is one of the reasons that we have a program which aims at keeping skilled, talented young designers, architects particularly, out of Cambridge, out of Harvard, and to enable them and induce them to stay home, to work in their own communities. So, I mean, it's a very controversial program.
Could this be the idea of the embedded architect in a way? Is this?
Yeah.
Go back to the point of embeddedness.
Yeah, it's hard to do that. You know, it's a sacrifice for people to say, no, you shouldn't go to Cambridge. You know, stay here. You're gonna, you know, you won't have as rich an education, but you'll have a richer life as a practitioner. But we're trying to reverse that. But what I'm saying, just to respond to your larger point, and then maybe we can bring other people into the discussion. I don't think that putting an emphasis on quality is inimical to emphasizing inclusion. That's a fundamental issue. We can make more and more people have good skills without regulating, as places like Cambridge or Harvard do, access to those skills. And that's fundamentally where I am as a designer about this. So and a lot of, when I was in practice, a lot of my work was about helping people who have no design skills to become more sophisticated about it. I don't think there is a conflict between quality and equality, but we're caught in that because that's what, I don't know, I'm sure Cambridge doesn't do this, but Harvard boasts about how few people it takes in, you know? The moment you start making that boast, you're lost. You're in the guild world.
Yeah, I mean, the whole system of rankings and producing hierarchies is absolutely uprooting.
It's no way to produce quality. You know?
And at the same time, you know, architectural education has, it depends where, but kind of not only divorced itself from embeddedness, perhaps, but also from craft, from actually making things with one's hands. Right. You talk about the power of an embodiment, the tacit.
Yes, I think that's very true. Critical. I think that's very true.
If I may ask you kind of one more quick thing to do with our present moment, before we kind of open up, you know, to do with the pandemic, to do with, I would suggest a resurgent interest in the local, for better and for worse, perhaps. I think all the points you've made are very well taken. The fact that we've seen extremely unequal access to healthcare, that it's exacerbated inequality tremendously at a territorial scale, that becomes a new landscape for capital invasion and gentrification. But it also, we've seen, let's say, appeals to, at least at a kind of government level, to neighborhood solidarity. We've seen mutual aid movements come up to feed old people, perhaps a nostalgic return to ideas of local support. And both these things are kind of happening at the same time. So first, I wonder if you might want to reflect on what this is doing to our cities. And secondly, if you might be able to reflect on, you know, how city leaders have been reacting, right? So we've seen in Paris the push for the 15-minute city by the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, which again invokes the idea of the neighborhood, perhaps even is a bit nostalgic of the guild and all the problems that have come up. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, they don't quite go in that direction. What I and my team are thinking about is a relation between green and healthy cities in terms of density. We're preparing for COP26, and we know that the urban dimension about dealing with climate change and green cities is got to be in large part about how to make use of density so that there's less spread out forms of keeping density alive that are efficient and so on. Whereas in a green city, density, particularly in mass transport, is a threat. So this is a craft issue. The politicians will just, well, the British politicians are out of this, but I mean, intelligent politicians will say, well, what should we do? And I think what they should do is focus on ways of trying to find people who can live densely, but in environments where that density is flexible, so that it can, when you have a pandemic, for instance, that the built forms allow people to separate. It's a real challenge, particularly in terms of transport, because, well, also housing, because people go back to the idea of a gated community as a place you isolate people. You're healthy. Gated communities are unbelievably energy squanderers and inefficient. So I'm trying to think now with my team about we're experimenting with different models of transport density in terms of timing, the actual, the machines that people travel in, and so on. The 15-minute city is, as you say, it's a kind of nostalgic view of how to make a city healthy. It's an extremely privileged one. If you're in Mexico City or most places in Southeast Asia, the factories that you work at, if you're a worker, are hours away from where you live. You don't live near them. And you can't walk in 15 minutes to any place where you have work. So this works very well if you're a middle-class person working online. I mean, the distinction is between somebody working in a bank who can work online and somebody who picks up garbage, you know? So you can't detach yourself that way. So the problematic that we're looking at is how, from the point of view, particularly of poor cities, that we can sort of square the circle of density. And good quality design is, I think, key to dealing with this problem. And I hope we'll present some of it actually in Cambridge next autumn during COP26. So stay tuned.
Maybe I'm gonna, why don't we open it up? If people have questions, please type them in the chat. And
oh, good. Then I'll be able
to. That should come up in the chat, yeah, and we can kind of make sense of them together.
Okay.
While people do that, maybe ask one more question related to kind of good design in cities and the problem of scale and distance. You talk about how in the Craftsman, when the blueprint becomes a legal document, something lost. How should we think of designing good cities if not through the blueprint?
Well, there are actually a lot of buildings leave the blueprint when you build at the scale of the individual building. What we haven't done is create urban fabrics that are as flexible in being created. I'll give you an example of this in Cambridge. That Cambridge is actually working on plans of urban design, which were concocted not by the university, but by Cambridge Planning Office about 15 to 18 years ago. So there's no hands-on knowledge, which is translating itself into how Cambridge grows. It's all been blueprinted. It's been officially approved. There's no learning about this. And since it's going to take a long time, there's no feedback mechanisms once the plans are approved. It's the same problem in Britain with HS2, which is an extremely elaborate transport system connecting the north to London. And there's no on-the-job learning about that. And the thing about craftsmanship is that it's a process of feedback. You don't take an object as absolutely rigid in form. You may have a type form of it that is a kind of overall maquette, which is the beginning of working. But when you're actually in the ground or linking up parts of a transport system over 10 or 15 or 20 years, there should be a constant process of thinking back, how should we diverge from the original plan? And that goes back to building as well, that we want to have buildings that in time are flexible enough so that they can be remade by how people inhabit them or use them. That's why I am, although I'm just about to retire, but I'm not a proponent of any kind of World Heritage Site preservation, because it makes the built object into a static form, independent of how it gets used. If somebody wanted to put a Pret in the bottom of St. Paul's Cathedral, I'd swallow hard, but I do it. And more realistically, I think that a lot of the historic preservation we do is really, it's a kind of tyranny over future generations. So that's the kind of thing that, to me, a good craftsman and good craftsmanship is about finding forms which can evolve. And it's going to be a great practical challenge for us, for instance, in converting unused office towers into flats. It's a challenge in terms of the infrastructure, everything from, soil stacks to lighting to access to fresh air. But that's a kind of, as a design thing, that is a goal for me, that actually the hands-on experience of building or living in a space is able to transform the forms that were there before.
Okay, so a process that is alive, that is embedded and cooperative. I think heritage as important as from scratch, if not more so. So we got some questions in the chat. Maybe I will read them out loud for everybody to hear. I'll start with the second one because it caught my eye first. But it says, can you comment on relations of power to cooperation? So going back to the early part of our conversation, does it inherently contain power imbalances? So is all cooperation necessarily imbalanced? The craftsman, the student, the master builder? If yes, then how does cooperation and inequality look like or can look like a city? The second part is a little bit less clear to me, but do you think that we can get out of the idea of a master and a student in relation to cooperation?
Master-slave, Hegelian terms. Well, I think as a practical matter, if it's a question of who you're cooperating with, and if you follow my suggestion about that the cooperatives people need are between the designer and the public rather than the designer and the funder or the sponsor, that means that cooperation and resistance are pretty much going to be built together. And there's an old story on the left, which is that resistance can take a Leninist form in which the people who are resisting are disciplined by a leading class, or it can take a more Kropotkin-like form in which there is no leader. And I think that's the great ambiguity in design work. How do you treat the public as an equal? And that kind of cooperation is good because it resists power, but it poses a problem of what to do with the expertise that designers have and the public who lacks that expertise. Is that clear what I'm saying? So I am when I went to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, the emphasis was all about translating plan into policy. And this seemed to me to be a mindset, a way of thinking, which is, it's very top down and it's very undemocratic. And how to translate, how to translate plan into action. And what we want in a more realistic world of power is how people can act together against plans, how to resist them, how to demand that the power change what it does. I've sort of lost, since I've been in Britain, I don't go to many planning presentations because they're a kind of joke. You know, you had planners get up, they show 150 slides of a proposal and ask, are there any questions? This is not planning. This is not consultation. This is just the opposite. It allows, it only, people are bewildered. We need a different kind of way of designing, which includes true cooperation. And it's going to be that way of true cooperation, given the capitalist world we're in, means resisting power. That's my own view about this.
This is good for the relevant for the next question, which is about kind of the sustainability of cooperation you're talking about, iterative plans.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit. Can you say it again? I don't know
so
why.
Sorry. It's my connection. I'm very sorry. There's a question about the long-term sustainability of cooperation, about how to maintain that iterative relationship. And I might suggest, maybe a little bit pushing back, that it has something to, the longevity of cooperation might have something to do with perhaps local scale embeddedness, that people can stay put and don't feel the need to leave, go miles away if they can. Which would only really be possible if one kind of decommodified our relationship to land. This is what kind of pushes us back and forth. So I wonder what you think about long-term relationships and cooperation, and how you keep people in place to keep those cooperative structures going, or if that's even the...
Again, that's... I don't sort of buy the premise of it, that the best sorts of cooperation are the most durable in time. I think we need lots of temporary and shifting alliances once we have a basic set of things we want to accomplish that don't freeze us into one pattern of association or action. This is a big deal practically in the UN, because we're thinking all the time about sustainability goals and so on. And when we took this first on in 2011, the notion was that sustainable equals durable. And that got to be a real problem for us in talking about climate change, because the conditions of climate change are extremely, they're not linear, they're path dependent, they're shifting constantly. And if you get fixed into one mode of dealing with climate change, the climate is going to defeat you. You need to have different ways associated with different kinds of people over the course of time as the climate problem itself shifts. So we're thinking about this in terms of how we structure our own responses to this. There's and again, it's quite interesting about the scale, question of climate scale. There are some things that people can do which are very effective locally and urbanistically in dealing with climate change. But there are other things in which the local scale is meaningless. For instance, dealing with, I'll give you a very concrete example of this. Our fantasy 5 years ago was that there would be a solar panel on every rooftop in every community in the city. And then we started doing some calculations about how much energy rooftop panels can capture. And the answer is not as much as enormous changes in solar panel farms or mega farms, which are a far more efficient way of capturing the sun. The same thing is true in capturing water power from tides. This is not a local project. So as I say, there are things that cities can do to be more climate friendly. But there are other ways. It's not a question of national scale. The climate doesn't know the difference between Bangladesh and India, for instance. It's not a meaningful thing. But the scale in another sense of both in generating power and also in dealing with tsunamis and things like that is it has to be top down, you know, because it has to be coordinated. So, I mean, it's a complexity. It was painful for me because I believe in neighborhood life as is a good thing. But neighborhood life is not going to be adequate to deal with sustainability in that shifting, large-scale way.
So would you say that the work you're doing with the UN is about parsing out which problems or issues should be addressed at which scale, and kind of creating an infrastructure for how we imagine dealing with problems?
Exactly, yeah.
I'm going to ask another question if we have time. We're an hour in. How are we doing on time, organizers?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Richard, are you okay with a couple more questions?
I am. I actually have a work meeting
right now.
Yeah, but I'll just send them an email and said that I'll be a few minutes late because it's 1:30 in New York.
Okay, so
they're all back from lunch. They've maybe had a martini or 2 martinis. They're back in the basement of the UN. So anyhow, but I'll take a couple more questions if they can wait.
Okay, maybe a couple quick ones. So we have one from Pete Bond that says, "What can we learn from nomadic architecture?"
A lot. It's the most adaptive architecture. I think there's a lot, and it's highly efficient. There are, by the way, there is an interesting book on nomadic architecture whose author has just escaped me. But there are actually many nomadic architectures, tent architectures. There are buildings which are put up and then abandoned. There are lots of models about what nomadic means. One very sophisticated version of that I've been a little involved with is movable theater spaces designed by Toshido Ito. And these are kind of like movable, they're theaters, but they're also community centers that are tents that can be taken down and recomposed anywhere in a city in 2 days. And it's inspired by Berber tent making, highly sophisticated, very urban, and very mobile, very way of making nomadic architecture is something that's in the city, you know. When I remember the author of this book, I'll send it to you.
Please, thank you. That question was actually from Asif Khan, the architect who will be speaking later in the seminar series.
Oh, great. Well, I'll be sure to listen to him.
So that would be an interesting conversation to have. Maybe we'll wrap up with a final kind of big question, just because I'm wary of time, which is coming from Ibrahim Abdu, and it's a huge question, but maybe we can have a quick little response to leave us thinking as we log off. Ibrahim asks, as you know, there's so few opportunities for architects given, well, let's say architects to do maybe interesting or positive, have a positive impact considering the way the market works for architects. So he asks about what you imagine the expanded role of the architect could be. What are other things that architects could or should think about and get involved in?
That's a wonderful question. I'd like to see, I'd like to see actually, speaking from my own bailiwick, that a lot of architects would get involved in doing community organizing. Because a lot of times community organizing is either just feel good, oh, you poor people, or government policy things. There's something about architecture, about its propositional nature, that things can be built one way or another, which is extremely important in organizing in communities. That is, that action is propositional, that it could be this way or it could be that way. There's not one right way. There's not a best practice. Choices need to be made. And since we're trained in that in architecture, that's the very heart of what we should be doing. It's a skill which I really think would serve people working socially very well. And I've made this proposition to young students that if you're doing crappy jobs for 5 years in an office designing toilets or doing window treatments, get out of it. That this is a skill that translates into, it's something that human beings need. Do something more with it. So you've rung a bell that I feel very, very strongly about, that the best thing we can do in architectural training to train people, if they're not going to be architects, is to strengthen this notion of propositional design. And I think that's for people who are not going to be able to work, and most architects aren't going to be able to do significant architecture. I think it's a great background to doing something more socially relevant.
Great. I think that's a wonderful provocation to kind of wrap up on. I think to all the students out there listening, we're very, I think, hopefully very well suited for this kind of, for confronting this provocation, perhaps particularly in MAUD or MPhil, which combines research and design and tries to reimagine what the expanded architecture could be. And certainly also in our undergraduate lectures. I know I care very much about this. I know Irit does with their new course on activism.
You no longer do architectural design itself, do you? Is part two, I'm just asking you as a, you no longer give part two, do you?
We do give part two, absolutely.
Oh,
it's the Center for Research Architecture, run by Ingrid Schroeder, which has a kind of big fieldwork component and a very long written dissertation, as well as a design proposal. So I think that's very much the spirit of the program.
Oh, great! That's great. It's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me. You'll see me next autumn if we manage to do this in Cambridge about density, and I'll be sure to let you know. And I would like, if I may, to sit in when your colleague who does nomadic architecture speaks. So I'll put that in my notebook. Okay. So
thank you so much. We'll definitely send you all of that, and we very much look forward to the results of your labor, the fruits of your labor, of your craft.
Let's hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.
So the next lecture will be on the
February the 2nd, right? Yeah.
February the 2nd with Ricardo Camacho, also at the same time, 5:30 till 7, more or less.
So that should be up on Eventbrite soon, right? So yes, everyone can sign up. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next time as well.